But in the following year, in 1950, I decided that I should finish my midwifery training, which was divided into 2 periods of 6 months each. And I had done the first 6 months and decided that I should finish the training, as I said. And I applied to... I must have done part 1 again. So this is all wrong. I must have done part 1 again at the Jewish hospital and passed. Because when I went to St. Anthony, I had part 1. Where did I do part 2? Oh, part 2 I did in Leicester. I lived with the coal miners in that hovel. I remember now. Yes, in 1950, I decided that I must finish my midwifery training. And I wrote to various training schools. And there was a vacancy in Leicester, in the city of Leicester. My sister was living there at the time, which I was pleased about that. And so I went down to Leicester and entered the training school there for part 2 midwifery. I remember it quite well because it was so very different from nursing in St. Anthony the previous year, because once again I was back in England and hospital there with all the rules and regulations and strict discipline. And the fact that you were training as a midwife meant that you started right at the bottom again, with no seniority and, of course, no real responsibilities. But it was a 6 months training. The first 3 months was spent in the maternity hospital, going to lectures, attending antenatal clinics, and delivering babies under supervision. I think that was the first 3 months of the 6 month training. The problem was that, of course, this was following the war. There'd been a great deal of bombing in Leicestershire, and accommodation for the midwives was in very short supply. However, the hospital was obligated to find you accommodation. And I remember very well going to the office to be told where my billet would be, and was told that it was at a certain address and on a certain road in the city. But it wasn't very suitable, as they said. It was not at all suitable. However, I think I had the temerity to inquire, which one never did in those days, just why it was not suitable. And they said, well, it had been condemned. They weren't putting nurses there because it had been condemned by the authorities as not suitable. But there was nowhere else. So off you go. I went to this house with my suitcase of things, and it was not suitable. There was a great deal of coal mining in the outskirts of Leicestershire in those days, and this small house belonged to a coal mining family. Father and 2 sons, all miners, and mother. And it was very small, not very clean, and I had a little room there, I remember, but they were so sparsely furnished that I remember sitting on my suitcases with my books on the bed to study. There was a bathroom There was no plumbing, indoor plumbing. That was at the bottom of the garden. And of course it was used by the coal mining family. And it was very uncomfortable. The miners, the men, when they came back from the mines, they would wash in the kitchen sink, which was about a couple of feet away from the table where I had my meals when I was there. So it was not very pleasant. But however, as they said, there was nowhere else. And I could go to my sister's when I was off duty, but I couldn't sleep there. Anyway, the time went by, and the first 3 months were completed, and the second 3 months you were outside the hospital. On your own. You had to provide yourself with a bicycle, and they provided a bag which had all your necessary equipment in it for deliveries, and you were given a section in your area of the city. You undertook to care for the mothers, which included going to the antenatal clinics and visiting them, and when they went into labour, you delivered in the homes. They didn't go into hospital. Quite often it seemed that they delivered at night, and then the husband or somebody in the family would come and bang on the front door of the house where I was living and say that I was needed. This is the same for all of us. And so you took your bag and got your bicycle out, and you went to the house and stayed with the mother, of course, and she would be in labour, and deliver the baby and see that all was well, and then go back to your billet. Leicester had been bombed during the war, and it was a very poor district that we looked after as pupil midwives, and some of them had been damaged by the air raids, and I can remember one or two things where you would push the bed against the wall to straighten it up, perhaps, make things more convenient for the delivery, and one leg of the bed go down a hole because there was a hole in the floor. And but that seemed very little consequence, really. Some of the houses there were in very bad shape, and the mothers and father, of course, would be there, and several of them, couples, had several children, and the first thing you did was to tell father to take the children out of the room and go out and sit on the stairs. They used to have these tenements where there were a lot of stairs, and it always seemed to me that father and the children sat on the stairs and waited till the new arrival had arrived and they could come in. And another little thing I remember is that we wore this uniform of navy blue coats and small round navy blue hats with a badge on. And we were taught that you always took with you a clean newspaper when you went to each house for delivery. The first thing you did was to spread this newspaper out, take off your coat and fold it inside out neatly, and place it on the newspaper, and place your hat on top of the coat with just a little round cap, and place that on the coat, and quickly fold up the newspaper and leave it somewhere. This is what you did first of all. because of the possibility of vermin in the room. And so you wrapped up your hat and coat, so it was quite safe from anything that might arrive on it. And we were very, very strictly trained in everything we did. And so you did your delivery. Now there was, I won't need to go into the aspects of delivery. One thing was that you could call on what was called medical aid. Medical aid was a doctor, and there was a list of not a very long list, but there was a list of conditions where you were to call medical aid and the doctor was to come and take over. But the doctors were in very short supply, and they didn't much like going out in the middle of the night if you were there in the night. So quite a lot of them would say, well, you know exactly what to do, don't you? So you do it, and I'll come when I can, which meant quite often you didn't see them at all, so you did what you'd been trained to do. Unless, of course, it was a very severe emergency when you informed they must come immediately and send the ambulance. However, you did domiciliary midwifery, that was called, where they were domiciled in their homes, the mothers. And the next day you had to write up in full detail, all part of the training, exactly the record of the delivery, etc. And you did that for the second 3 months of the training. You also did antenatal clinics and postnatal clinics where you saw the mothers before and after. They were followed very carefully. It was a very good system. And you visited your postnatal mothers for, I think it was 4 weeks. After that time, the public health nurses took over. So that was the second part of midwifery. And then came the exam in London. And that was all right. I passed that. So I was now state certified midwife, an SCM. So I felt that I could go back to Labrador if I had definitely made up my mind to. However, eventually I was asked to go to Northwest River, Labrador, to go back to Northwest River this time to replace Miss Smith, Jean Smith, who had been there several years without any break at all. And she was very well known on the coast. She was an excellent nurse and had a great reputation for her hard work and her efficiency. And I remember being told in the London office that this was really a position of some responsibility, which Miss Smith had filled so magnificently for so long. So this time I flew back. There was now a flight possible from London, landing in Goose Bay in Labrador and continuing on to St. John's and the rest of Canada. I remember landing at Goose Bay in the night, and the plane continued on, of course, as I say, to St. John's. So there didn't seem to be any airport buildings such as one would expect. And I remember walking for some time, and I also remember that eventually I came into the small graveyard which was situated at the end of the runway, and turning back out of there, and then finding one of the Air Force buildings on the base, where I went in and was given breakfast and a room to lie down in. I think they must have told me that there was nobody from the Grenfell Mission hospital down at Northwest River at the time, but no doubt they would eventually come for me. I was wakened later on by one of the RCMP who told me to get up and go with him down to Happy Valley. And I remember very well riding down there in a vehicle, I suppose, although I didn't know it was a Jeep. It was very bumpy, I remember, and I hit my head against the roof of this vehicle very hard. And there seemed to be some sort of metal bar going across the roof. I remember it very well. However, it didn't do any damage. And I was taken down to the tiny nursing station in Happy Valley, which was run by the mission. There was one nurse there, Miss Annie Rhodes, and I think there were just 2 beds for admissions, and she had a small room for herself and a small dispensary. And she told me that if I waited there, they would eventually send a boat for me, which, after some time, arrived with Mr. Jack Watts, came ashore and told me that he'd take me back to Northwest River, and picked up my suitcase and went aboard this motorboat and rode down to Northwest River. This, I think, was about midday by then. I remember arriving at Northwest River because the hospital ship, the Marival, was tied up at the wharf, and I had to step out of one boat onto the other and cross that one and onto the wharf. It wasn't too difficult, but it seems to stay in my mind. And then I was taken up to the hospital, which faced the river, and was a small building, a white building with green trim, and it had a little avenue of trees up to it and some grass and some flowers, and it looked perfectly delightful. I was so happy to be there. Also, I remember being greeted by Miss Smith, Jean Smith, at the top of the steps leading up into the hospital on the porch. And she said, well, you're here. Yes, she said, I'm pleased to see you. And I remember her saying, well, before we go inside, I just wanted to tell you 1 or 2 things. And she had a list in her hand, and it was quite a long list of things to be done during the summer, and which was fine. It was a little bit intimidating, I found, because the last thing on the list I remember so well was that I was to make slip covers for the staff sitting room out of blue denim. I wasn't sure what a slip cover was or blue denim, but obviously it included sewing, which I could not do at all. I could not sew. But however, it just stayed in my mind. Then we went in. She showed me my room. There were 2 bedrooms on the ground floor and a sitting room. And behind that was a kitchen on one side and a little dispensary along the back and a waiting room. The next thing I remember was the door at the back going into the dispensary being opened. I think I was starting to unpack my things, and this doctor, who was Dr. Paddon, called to me and said, "Hello, do you know how to put in stitches?" "Do you know how to suture, I suppose," he said. And I said, "Well, yes, I did." And he said, "Well, come out here and so I went out there to the dispensary, and he told me that this gentleman who was sitting there needed his scalp sutured. He had, it all seemed to be a big joke. I remember it so well. They were both laughing, and he told me it was, I think it was Malcolm McLean, had said that he'd fallen off a ladder, which seemed to be very funny to them both, and he'd cut his head. Anyway, this was a sort of private joke, it seemed to me. And he said, "So you suture him up, and you'll find needles and whatever you need here somewhere." And off he went. So I sutured him up, and he left, and I went back and finished unpacking and so on. And that was all right. And then Miss Smith came in and sat down with me and explained a few things about the work and how hospital was run, and that I would find anything I needed in the attic, such as the blue denim and extra linen, and it was a very old building, and she said, "The roof leaks, so you must watch carefully and see that the various pans and basins were put under the leaks." We were supposed to be getting a new hospital, but they didn't quite know when, and in the meantime, this was the hospital. And of course, she showed me round. It was very full. I think that hospital was built for 8 beds, but there were many, many more. I think there were more like 16 in there, the children's cots. She said, if Dr. Paddon wants to operate, there is an operating table under the stairs. And what you have to do, you pull the stairs up. They're on a rope. There's a rope. And if you pull the rope, the stairs will lift up, and the table is under there, you see. Yes, I see, I said. And she said, "I shall be leaving tomorrow, and this is your hospital." And that was fine, and we had supper, I remember, and went to bed, and I think I was quite tired by then. But however, in the night, I was wakened by somebody in my room, and matches being struck. I can't quite remember if we did have, I think we had lamps in our rooms. I'm not sure about that. However, the person in my room was one of the, as we said in those days, the Indian people who were camped across the river, across Northwest River. And he made me understand that I was needed to go with him. And he went out. So I think, as far as I remember, I went up to Miss Smith's bedroom and said, "There seems to be a man downstairs who wants me to go with him." And I remember very well Miss Smith saying, "Well, very well, go with him and take the black bag." So I went, I got dressed, and he was out there on the porch, and I went with him. We we went down to the river, and he had a canoe. And he got in the canoe. Well, I'd never been in a canoe, but I managed to get in. And we set off. It was wonderful. It was moonlight. And we went up the river, quite close to the shore, it seemed to me. But we seemed to be going away from the community. However, at Northwest River, the current is very strong. And apparently one goes upriver to cross over and come down the other side. We came down the other side very fast. And then he stopped and we got out of the canoe and I saw that there were tents. And he just went ahead and I just followed him. And to one of the tents. And I had no idea really what it was all about, but I presume there was somebody who was ill. And we went in the tent and nobody really said anything, but people smiled. I remember the tent was full of people, and dogs too. And everybody was sitting on the ground. But I really wasn't sure why I was there. And then the old ladies who sat in a group pointed over and smiled and pointed, and I realized there was a young woman in labor. And so that's why I was there, I presumed. She made no noise at all. And she was kneeling. I'd never delivered a baby in the kneeling position. And also her husband was kneeling too, very close to her. In fact, I think he had his arms round her. And the baby was very near delivery, so I didn't really have to deliver the baby, but I was there, and the baby was born. And everybody smiled and laughed, and it was a very happy occasion. So I looked after the mother and tidied her up and so forth. And there was a very happy tent full of people. And so after that it was all very simple, and she lay down, and I think somebody gave her something to drink, some soup or something like that, and they smiled at me and nodded, and time to go home. So I went back and got into the canoe and went back up river and down river and back. By that time, I think it was nearly daylight. So I got dressed. Miss Smith came down all ready to leave. And she said, "What did they want?" And I said, "I went across the river with them." "Oh, yes," she said. I said, there was a delivery." "Oh, yes," she said. And then she said, I remember so well, she said, "They didn't really need you, you know. They just wanted to have a look at you. They wanted to see the new squish." That's what they called the nurse. You know, that's what they wanted. You didn't have to go. Well, you did have to go, but you weren't needed. "Oh, I see." She said, "Oh, yes, they've been waiting for the new nurse. I've been here so long, you know. They're quite excited about somebody else coming." "Well, goodbye, and I'll be back later. I'll be back in the fall. Or I'll be back for Christmas or something," she said. And she was gone. Then this doctor appeared. He said, "Well, I'm off now on the Marigold." "Oh." And he said, "Yeah, I'll be gone several weeks. If you really need me, you can ask Jack Watts to get through to me on the RT, but you won't reach me after," where was it? Nain, I think. Oh, I see. He said, you'll manage, all right. Jean showed you everything, did she? I said, oh yes, and well, you'll be fine. I'll be back later on. Goodbye. And he was gone, and the Marable left. Then this Mr. Watts arrived, and he said, well, I don't know what he told you, but I'm not going to be here either. So he said that you would get through on the RT. Yes, he said, but I'm going down to St. Anthony. But you'll be all right, you'll be all right. And I said, I see, I see, I've got time. Off he went. So I had the hospital to myself. I had a cook, Jessie Lyle was the cook, and 2 aides. And one was May Suley, who became May Becky, and the other was Phyllis Mucker. They came to work every day at the hospital, and we became friends. And they were very good, and without them I could not have managed at all. The next day, of course, I found that Jean and Dr. Paddon and Mr. Watts had gone, and I really had to begin to organize my time. It all went very well. There were emergencies, and I remember being called up to old Mrs. Blake, who had fallen down. I think she'd fallen down some stairs, and she had fractured her elbow, or her upper arm elbow. It was broken quite badly, and I did put that up in a splint, which in my day in training in London was called an aeroplane splint, because it was a big splint at right angles, looked rather like the wing of a plane. However, I remember that. And several other occasions. Most of the work was routine work, and we had, all the beds were always filled, and there were a few emergencies in outpatients, one of them being Gordon Gowdy, who had an accident when he was getting his wood in, and he had managed to injure his wrist with his axe, and I realized that the tendons had been severed. I remember thinking that I had seen tendon repair in my training, of course, by the surgeons. I really didn't think I could undertake to repair a tendon, but of course his hand had dropped, and I really felt that I should make an attempt to repair what I could. And eventually I did manage to suture as I had seen it done. The 2 ends of the tendon. Of course, one end, of course, was in situ, but the other end was a little difficult to find. But however, I did the best I could and splinted it, and spent a lot of time after that wondering what Dr. Paddon would say when he came back, whether he'd be very annoyed or how it would go, because it really was rather alarming. However, Mr. Gowdy didn't seem to mind, and he went off home. And I'm not sure whether he ever had full use of that hand again or not, but I think he did quite well. Well, Dr. Paddon came back eventually and looked at it, and I think he attended to it rather better than I had. And I think all was fairly well in the end. There were other problems, of course, but nothing that I thought I couldn't handle fairly well. Although the RT now was silent because Mr. Watts had gone. Nobody else could use it. He came back after a time, of course. And so the summer went by, and I came to know the people very well, and I was extremely happy. I enjoyed every day. It was so different, of course, utterly so different from nursing in England. And I was so thankful, really, that I had had such a good training in wartime in England. I felt that I could handle the situation fairly well. And the summer went by, and Dr. Paddon came back, and it was a very busy time. There were all sorts of difficulties and maintenance in that old hospital, apart from the roof leaking. We, of course, burned wood in a huge furnace in the basement, and the summer volunteers, the boys, WAPs as they were called, which stood for Without Pay, came in mostly from the United States, and they worked all summer up at the head of the lake, bringing wood down for the furnace for the winter and stacking it in huge wood piles. There was also one girl who came up from New York, and she was to help me out with the running of the hospital. She was excellent. She was a very nice girl, and she didn't mind what she did. She was a tremendous asset. And she would go down to the homes where people were sick and nurse them in their homes, and also help with all the work in the hospital. Because in those days there was just one nurse and one volunteer. Though we also had a barn. We had, I think it was 6 cows in the barn, and bull, and we had chickens, and we had pigs, and wonderful vegetable gardens. There were also some children in the dormitories who had not, most of the children had gone home for the summer. They came down for schooling at Northwest River, and they started to come back, of course, in the end of August for school in September. Though some stayed year-round. There were various illnesses and accidents and so on with the children. They were looked after in the dormitories. And there was the United Church, and the minister and his wife, who had been there for a very long time, Reverend Mr. Barry and Mrs. Barry. And of course I got to know everyone in the village, and it was a very happy place, and a very straightforward, simple, down-to-earth way of life. The Indian people across the river would always leave in the early fall to go back into the country, as it was called. They would take down their tents practically overnight and collect up the dogs, and also collect up any patient that was in the hospital. They wouldn't go into the country and leave anyone behind. which nobody had told me that. And I had a little boy in the hospital. He was only, I think, about 5, and he had a very severe dog bite in the front of his leg. And Dr. Paddon had managed to clean it and take a skin graft from his thigh. And we applied the skin graft to this leg and hoped it would take it. It was very difficult, because skin grafts are very difficult in the best of hospitals. And to make them take, as it's called, to heal, takes a great deal of careful nursing. However, I had looked after him quite well, I thought, until the day his father came, walked upstairs, picked the little boy up out of the cot, put him over his shoulder, and walked down the stairs again with him, which worried me dreadfully. I can remember running down the stairs after him, saying, "No, no, 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 you mustn't take him away, don't take him, no, bad leg, he had a bad leg," and protesting very loudly, but to no effect. His father just walked out the front door with the boy and went off across the river. And I remember thinking, whatever will Dr. Paddon say? I thought he'd be very annoyed that I'd allowed the child to be taken, and that we wouldn't see to his skin graft ourselves. However, I needn't have worried, because when he got back, I was very worried, and I said, "I'm very much afraid that this little Indian boy was taken by his father, because they've all gone from across the river, and he's gone too." And I remember Dr. Paddon saying, "Oh, that's all right, of course, yes, they would take him, yes. Actually," he said, "when they come back next year, you'll find that has healed completely, far better than we could have done." And so it was. They had healed it, they had used their own methods, and it had taken, and it was perfect, no infection. And so it went on. And that was the kind of life that I thought was, well, it really was the best time of my life. However, the winter was approaching, and I was only supposed to be there for 6 months, and Miss Smith would be back. And eventually she returned, and my time there was up. I remember saying goodbye to everybody. A lot of them were saying, where's you going, miss? Where's you going, miss? Well, of course, during this time, these months in the summer, Dr. Paddon and I realized that we enjoyed being together, we enjoyed working together, we were understood each other very well, and although we were always so busy and the work came first, we were very comfortable in each other's company, and of course we were beginning to be very fond of one another. And this, I suppose, was a factor, but all the same, it didn't make any difference to the fact that I was going to Harrington. This was in my contract. And Miss Smith had returned, Jean had returned, and therefore it was time for me to go.